Also, I want to welcome those who are connected to our webinar. This webinar is really focusing on, once again, trying to support every LEA in understanding how monitoring visits are connected to feedback to ensure program evaluation and effective use of resources. Remember, this is just a reminder that the civil rights obligations to ensure quality instruction for all English learners is funded through your regular state funding. That Title III and Title I and all other resources are supplemental funding. But the way in which you fund the work that you do for English learners to ensure quality instruction based on civil rights law is actually a right that they have for a quality education. So funding is not the issue. So let's look at the theory of action. So I'm trying to frame this in a way that you can be very clear about the purpose of monitoring visits. So the theory of action is if we are all learners together, then receiving feedback from a monitoring visit that identifies promising instructional practices as well as areas for growth will enable every LEA to better evaluate the effectiveness of instructional programs to ensure that, 1, every teacher is supported by the LEA and school administrator in making grade-level content accessible to a range of English learners. Now remember, this is Tier 1 content level, grade level instruction for English learners. And 2, each English learner will achieve his or her annual growth goal toward English proficiency. Now, the annual growth goals are set by USBE and the Data and Statistics and Accountability Departments based on the indicators related to individualized growth goals for when a student entered Utah schools, so what grade level, and also at what level of proficiency when they're screened and monitored based on the home language survey, identifying them as potential English learners. And then 3, each English learner will have access to grade level content and academic disciplines of math, science, and English. Okay, so the theory of action is if we're all learners together and getting feedback based on classroom observations by content specialists from USBE and peer reviewers, and the final report will actually support the way in which change happens and how it is you evaluate the effectiveness of your programs at the school level. Okay, so that's the theory of action. Now the reason I'm talking about a theory of action, and just to be clear, Title III is not using the DMI, it's not using the UCA, it's not using any of that. It's using the grants management system. So in the monitoring function in the grants management system, the monitoring report that I send to you after we do the visit will be uploaded into the grants management system under monitoring. I mean, I will upload the report. I'll send it to you, the final report, to the superintendent and to your ALS team, and then it'll be uploaded into the grants management system. Now, this functions as an electronic portfolio for you with the self-evaluation tool with all your evidence to support what you're doing and your actual application for funding to see how you're adjusting your programs and evaluating the effectiveness of those language programs based on the school report cards, which we'll get to at the end. So, for further Title III funding, you upload the district's response to the recommendations and how you have prioritized your changes to support the civil rights for English learners for a quality education. Also, please explain how you disseminated the report and how you recognized exemplary teaching. Okay, so I'll give you a concrete example of the work that we did in Granite with a feeder pattern for refugee students. We sent the report to the superintendent and the ALS department and the curriculum director. And the superintendent sent the report to the actual schools, the administrators, the principals, and then asked for a report based on the recommendations that we offered. Now, this is the exemplary practice that we would hope that every LEA would use to make sure that there's clear communication instantly with the school principals who have been visited by the USBE and peer reviewers for classroom observations. So the organization of the district and the LEA recommendations. I'm only focusing on the recommendations. In every single LEA, every single principal, every single school, they get commendations and exemplary practices are identified, and teachers are acknowledged for the work that they're actually doing. It depends on what the district wants to do, what the school wants to do, to acknowledge the exemplary teaching of specific teachers in the school. An example is, we saw amazing math instruction in one elementary school at, I think it was the 4th grade level. In another district, we also saw exemplary math teaching for ELs, very well scaffolded, rigorous, very engaging. The question always ends up being, so why is it at one grade level you have one exemplary teacher who knows how to really scaffold instruction to make grade level content comprehensible to English learners, and then the rest of the grade level doesn't? So the question then becomes, how are PLCs being used to effectively support collaboration so that teachers know how to adjust their instruction based on what students can actually do and what their achievement is. So the way we've organized these recommendations are under 2 categories, based on the criteria of greatest impact on quality instruction and equitable opportunities for English learners. So 1 is systems change, and 2 is quality instruction. The underlying assumption here is that generally, if you continue to do the same thing that you've always done, you're going to have the same results, which means you're going to have the lowest achievement for English learners in the state. The reason that's important is the way in which you work with English learners supports the capacity of educators, administrators, district people to better understand the needs of individual English learners as well as their families. When we get to the section around parent engagement, there are lots of really important work that's being done by Cheryl Ellsworth and the impact that has on attitudes of teachers toward children. So let's look at the systems change, and the point of the systems change recommendations are for effective communication across district departments, especially business administration, instructional supports, department advocacy, access, equity departments, assessment, research, and all content specialists in curriculum. The reason this is incredibly important for effective communication is oftentimes ALS departments end up being marginalized at the district level. Okay, so this is not helpful if your literacy people, your instructional coaches, your math coaches, or however you organize your instructional specialists, if they have no knowledge of how to work with English learners and make content accessible. Okay, so here are the recommendations. Review and evaluate the effectiveness of each initiative that has been mandated based on the extent to which students learning English are achieving annual growth goals toward English proficiency and academic achievement in mathematics, science, and language arts. Prioritize initiatives based on mitigating teacher burnout, teacher turnover, and a lack of instructional focus. Now, the reason this recommendation is so important is that you cannot have mandated initiatives given to schools without any kind of evidence-based approaches to how they're going to impact the learning and the progress of English learners. So to have so many initiatives, you have to evaluate their effectiveness, right? I mean, that's really the point. And I'm hoping that the recent school report cards based on every single school will help you better understand the way in which you can do that. The second one is review and evaluate the use of computer software and other pull-out approaches to mitigate student isolation and lack of teaching academic conversation in every content area, especially in K-3. Now, in some classrooms, we saw the use of computer software as Tier 1 instruction. Okay, so just to be clear, oral language development, especially in the early grades, is really critical. And so that means the way in which we interact with the teacher, we help the kids develop oral language, is really critical. You know, science investigations for kids, you know, as well as talking about ways to solve mathematical problems. So these things are really critical in relationship to the development of oral language. Because remember, when kids come in and they're level 1 kids, basic interpersonal communication is based on creating welcoming, safe environments where lots of conversation happens, as well as the silent period when kids are actually learning context-embedded vocabulary related to what they're actually doing. Okay, so that's the second. The next one is now remember, the reason I'm giving you these is not just one school district, but we found this consistently across multiple districts. You know, this based on the observations, the focus groups with principals, the focus groups with parents of English learners, and with instructional coaches. So this is a comprehensive way. You know, we're not saying that you need to do this. We're saying these are the recommendations, and to continue funding, what are you going to decide to do to become more effective in the work that you're doing with classroom instruction? Okay, the next one is review and evaluate the effectiveness of the counseling program throughout the district, especially at the high schools based on the standards of comprehensive guidance. Now, the reason this is important is, you know, there's a new board rule, and in the next, it just got approved, about advanced coursework. Because when you look at the data, you see that, again, advanced coursework, early college coursework, and what prepares students for post-secondary education ends up not being accessible at all for English learners. So this is a really clear, in some ways a mandate, that clarity about equitable access to early college coursework for English learners is stipulated in the following documents. This includes clarity about standard policies and practices across all high schools about AP and IB fees related to fee waivers, and the least segregative environment, which is an OCR mandate, which includes not tracking English learners or limiting access to the district's gifted and talented programs. If the only way a teacher can make a recommendation for a parent for a student who is an English learner and has potential to be involved in gifted programs is through, testing that eliminates kids' abilities to be able to be involved in those gifted programs, or applications with computer programs that parents don't have access to, or no clarity about how gifted English learners can actually be involved in gifted programs, then that's actually a huge civil rights issue. And I've quoted the ESEA assurances, the civil rights, the third judicial permanent injunction, the new school waivers, school fee waivers, board rule that just passed, the revised board rule on enhanced accelerated students, and all the civil rights obligations. So utilize student information system to provide readily accessible information of students, especially when participating in ESL, other programs, and 4-year monitoring of exited ELs, to mitigate gaps of support when students transfer from one school to another. So Utah's pretty lucky. We have systems where we can ensure that when we do the 4-year monitoring of exited ELs, we're not going to let kids fall through the gaps, because you know that when kids are exited and the content becomes increasingly more challenging, that it's likely that students without extra support and paying attention would end up falling behind. It would be the same thing as if we went to another country, for example Russia, and we were trying to learn academic content in Russian. We might be able to speak it, but then the question is the actual content vocabulary that's so critical in being successful. Now this is highlighted in red because in the focus groups with parents are incredibly clear. They might not speak English. They might speak Spanish or Arabic or Somali or Sudanese or whatever, but they're really clear about the lack of a welcoming environment for themselves and their children. They're crystal clear. And when we become willing to create welcoming environments, we have to address these issues. Not as an accusation. That's not the point. The point is, how do we create welcoming environments in which the mindsets of educators create the opportunity to maximize the assets of every single child who comes into the door? That's really the point. So here we go. Review and evaluate the effectiveness of parent engagement based on the following issues identified by parents. This is identified by parents. Focus groups here, focus groups with large groups of parents. So policies and practices that limit opportunities for children who are learning English based on deficit thinking and mindsets of educators. Positive approaches to ensuring the civil rights of English learners to high-quality instruction are included in the Civil Rights Review in the Title III grant application and the self-monitoring tool, and now in the grants management system. The issue of opportunity gaps based on educator mindsets was mentioned by parents, in coaches' focus groups, and by principals. So, if we know that there's a serious issue in relationship to deficit thinking, then we have to be courageous and we have to address this, not by accusation, but by really creating and identifying the promising practices where other educators have maximized the assets and opportunities to ensure that English learners have equitable access to a high-quality instructional program, which includes advanced coursework. Culturally responsive professional learning opportunities, as well as trauma-informed care and restorative justice practices, can address not only what was mentioned by various groups across the district, but what was observed by some of the visiting USBE team members in schools. Now, the point is, and we know this, when educators, just as human beings, are stressed out, the way in which they interact with students sometimes becomes reactive. Now, the question is, how do school administrators, how do district leaders, LEA leaders, create the kind of support for teachers that ends up supporting them in having the kind of interactions that are nurturing, encouraging, and provide opportunities for students to understand what it means to be responsive to certain situations where, in fact, they might be reactive. That's what the restorative justice practices use. Policies that keep students locked out of schools during winter months. This is particularly mentioned by parents. And I understand, the issues of teachers wanting some quiet time, but there is a way that you could organize it so students aren't locked out of schools during the winter months. Many of the children that we support come from very warm climates, and they don't have the kind of clothing that supports them, and so they end up getting sick and missing school. And this is a concern for parents. Again, the lack of clarity regarding school fee waivers at the secondary level. As you know, we've been working on this for the last 2 years. The new board rule has come out. We have in the USBE internal auditors, we have 2 people simply designated for monitoring the issues related to school waivers. So this piece is really important. One of the reasons this happened was refugee students were receiving huge bills for fees that should have been waived for them, invoices in English, which, ends up terrifying refugee families. Policies and practices that create barriers for students who are recognized by teachers to be in the district's gifted programs. So these issues are really important in relationship to eliminating opportunity gaps for children whose economic future of their family and their community and Utah really depend on. The next one is review and evaluate the coaching initiative based on the following considerations. Okay, so the coaching initiative has been started. I was one of the people early on 20 years ago to work in collaborative coaching in Salt Lake. So these are the kinds of things that we found consistently across districts. It might be instructional coaches, it might be education specialists, or whatever name you call them. So well-established guidelines for principals based on the effective use of coaches for adapting classroom practices to support the needs of English learners. If an instructional coach comes to a school and the principal says, okay, now you can do yard duty, that's an ineffective use of funding. Okay, that's not the role of an instructional coach to do recess duty. The role of the instructional coach is to work with teachers in better understanding the actual practices that would be adaptive in relationship to what students need based on their language proficiency. That's why, when we go down to quality professional development, we'll look at the way in which key uses can be used to help teachers adjust their instruction. Collaboration across district departments to ensure effective and differentiated professional learning opportunities for coaches to become more skillful in coaching teachers and working effectively with grade level department and school teams. Okay, so the way in which coaches are assigned to schools. Okay, the goal is to create a criteria by which you understand and everyone is clear, principals, coaches, district personnel, the way in which coaches are assigned to support specific schools and what criteria that's based on. Flipping coaches to different schools without any clarity or communication with principals does not really support the work of the coach and puts the coach in a really challenging position. If coaches don't have the kind of experience that they need in Title I schools, based on kind of the disproportionate allocation of inexperienced teachers to Title I schools, then you have to really design the professional development that's differentiated based on what the coach needs to work with a specific context, in a specific context. We don't want to burn out the coaches. That's kind of the other thing. Clear and public criteria. This goes back to how coaches are assigned to schools with assurances by principals to ensure that effective use of skills and experience, ensuring consistency and coherence of support that builds relationships with teachers. Okay, you can't have a trusting, collaborative, collegial experience if you don't have a way in which coaches develop those relationships with actual teachers that they're working with and who understand who the learners are. That's supposed to be the function of the PLC. The function of the PLC is to develop the kind of collaborative skills that ensure the ability of adjusted practices and instruction based on what the students are producing, what the student work looks like. so that the students themselves know how to be more self-regulating and know how to make their work better. That's really the function of PLCs. So let's look at quality instruction. Now, based on Title III funding purposes, and because Title III accountability is in Title I, and Title I accountability is now a part of the state accountability system, one, increased English proficiency and increased growth in academic subjects. And when we look at the report cards, you'll see kind of how that plays out. So what's the first thing that would be important? Okay, so review and evaluate the professional development or professional learning opportunities for all educators, including administrators in the following areas. Now, these are all based on observations in classrooms with a wide range of USBE content specialists. When we go in and we see all teacher talk, okay, that's a serious problem. Teaching academic conversation to increase student engagement and student talk time. Okay, so the question ends up being, how is the LEA working with each of the principals to work with and observe in the classrooms so that student talk is the majority of time, and how is that structured? Designing instruction with the WIDA key uses. Now, if you're not familiar with the WIDA key uses, they're on the UEN website. And these 4 areas, recount, explain, discuss, and argue, are used across all content areas. And the way in which they've been designated is the way in which language functions in a classroom. And the use of teacher questioning and collaborative strategies to ensure Tier 1 instruction moves from DOK 1, which is just retrieving information, to DOK 2, using concepts, and DOK 3, reasoning and the use of evidence for justification. I've seen some of the best math instruction where, in 3rd grade, where the teacher says to the kids, okay, so turn to your partner, and they use hand motions, and explain why you're using this method to solve this problem. I saw this in, one math class with all refugee students when they were doing the Pythagorean theorem. I saw it in a 3rd grade class. I saw it in a 4th grade class. When you think of exemplary teaching, it's some of the best teaching I've ever seen. So the question is, how do we ensure that every single student, especially those learning English, have access to quality instruction? The other thing is the professional development on trauma-informed care, especially for children living in poverty or from refugee communities. Now, this is really a critical issue in relationship to the development, the mental development, and the capacity of students to tolerate stress and isolation when they come to school. Being in, I was in India and spent time in a Bengali Muslim refugee encampment in India. And the level of hardship there, ends up having a huge impact on the actual development of children. And so the question is, how do we become more sensitive and more knowledgeable about what that welcoming environment looks like? Again, the effective use of paraprofessionals. We've seen in many instances across all our observations that paraprofessionals aren't necessarily used as effectively. Now remember, paraprofessionals have to be skilled enough and monitored effectively in relationship to the teacher of record. You just can't have instruction being provided by paraprofessionals for English learners. They have to be qualified. It's, specifically a board rule. So let's look at some report cards. So the point of this is there's some really amazing teachers and some really great work being done. The question is, how do you disseminate that so that it ends up being not just these pockets of brilliant instruction, but how it is that you upscale it so that every school in Utah. Elementary, middle, and high school, the kind of quality instruction for English learners makes a huge difference in the lives of not just the children, but the family and their communities. So here's an example of the state of the state. This is some selected LEA report cards. So here's a northern school district. Now I'm just going to explain this and how we got to this. And also there's a link to the assessment accountability, and I'll send that to you, that explains the calculations. So now, because of state accountability, and English learner progress is a part of state accountability, and if progress is not made by a disaggregated group, a student group of English learners, then the lowest performing groups will be identified for targeted assistance. Now, targeted assistance is provided by the LEA. It's not the responsibility of USBE. But obviously, we want to support you in thinking strategically about how you're going to end up moving the English learners so that the level of state accountability moves you forward. I mean, that's really the point. So this is a northern district, and if you look at it, English learner adequate progress. Now, what this means is that 35% of all the English learners in this particular district have made their annual growth goal. Now, the 2.6% means that the English learners reaching proficiency, English proficiency, which means as determined by a 5.0 on the WIDA. Okay, now the reason this is important, just to be clear, is when you run course-taking patterns and kids who are English learners who end up taking advanced coursework become English proficient before they move to middle school. When they get to middle school, there's a drop in their proficiency levels in English. When they get to high school, there's another drop because of the transition issues, which I think are really critical. So it's just a way to think about how you're doing vertical teaming in feeder patterns to really support those transitions. Okay, now we're going to look at another report card. This is an elementary school where we visited and saw some really exemplary instruction. So they have commendable, and if you look at it, more than 50%, the majority of their students are English learners. If you look at it, more than 50% of their English learners achieved their annual growth goal. And the same school, the English learners reaching proficiency as a 5 on a WIDA, which is really challenging to do, as you know, since they recalibrated the actual assessment, is 12%. So the question is, how does that district learn from that school and that principal? And that particular school was a turnaround school, and that principal really worked in a way strategically to move the school within 2 years out of school improvement. One of the things in Title I schools where principals become distinguished schools, principals have said that they work on, first thing they work on is school culture, which means the attitudes of the educators in relationship to who the students are in their classroom and their families. So, not having the mindset that's all about deficit and children can't do this and they can't do that, and so you water down the curriculum and it's not well scaffolded so that they're actually engaged in their learning. And this is kind of typical, and it happens for all kinds of reasons. It's, a long-term issue in relationship to burnout and how teachers work collaboratively to mitigate that burnout and turnover. In the same school, you can see they worked on English language arts, and so it's very high. Their math scores, their math percentage is kind of the typical range. And science, they need to work on science. If you look at the growth of the lowest 25%, now remember, we're looking at growth. we're not looking at proficiency. So this is the piece that's really important and I think is valuable in the report card, that we're focusing on the element of, every year, how are the students growing toward proficiency? That's the goal. And if you look at it, it's more than 50%, almost 60% of the lowest 25% of the kids actually achieve their growth goals. So this is an example. If it can be done in one elementary school with a high level of English learners, it can be done in all elementary schools. Okay, now we're going to look a little bit at, here's a high school. And people, I was a high school teacher, and I did teach sheltered government and economics. I worked with English learners, I worked with AP kids, I worked with regular kids, whatever that means. And if you look at what this high school has done, okay, so this is a high school. Their learners' adequate progress is 50%. And the English learners that actually reached a level 5 was 3.6. Not as high as the other elementary school, but high school is really challenging. Another part of the report card, if you look at the work that they do, which is exemplary, is like off the charts. Those students who, this is post-secondary readiness, achieving the ACT, an 18 or more, it's almost 80% of their students in their high school. Their 4-year graduation rate is 94%. This particular high school, they have one of the highest graduation rates of English learners in the entire state. It is usually between 83 and 89%. And readiness coursework, that means courses in math and science and concurrent classes, is 85%. One way they do this is they look at content specific courses, and they allocate resources so that you have team teaching for English learners. So you have a content specialist, you have someone in English writing to really support them in academic writing. Then you have somebody who is an ELD specialist. So the way in which they work together is very collaborative, and it does make a difference. Advanced physics, applied physics. So a lot of the advanced coursework and concurrent work, they've made an intentional effort to ensure that there's equitable access. This is the same high school. So this is achievement, so this is proficiency level. Almost 40% in English language arts, mathematics 37, in science very high. I know the science people in this particular high school, and they're actually quite amazing. And you can see, even though mathematics is high, science is high, the growth of the lowest 25% is about 60%, so we would say that that would be typical. We would hope it would be more. And they have to do some work on English language arts, which is not surprising at the secondary level, since I was the specialist for secondary language arts, and there's some kind of obsessive fascination with only reading literature, and specifically the canon. There's nothing wrong with the canon, but the question is, how do we actually engage students in reading so that the rigor of what they're reading supports the way in which they interact with the real world. When I did focus groups with high school students in this particular high school, as well as other high schools, one of the things that the kids said, they didn't feel prepared to actually be in the real world after graduation, because no one has really explained to them how what they're studying is immediately relevant to the real world. And this is kind of across the board for 4 high schools with over 150 kids that we interviewed. So let's look at root cause, because this is one of the major things. I've seen some of the school improvement plans. I'm on a team that looks at that. So the root cause of low performance of ELs. Most people tend not to say this. Low expectations, deficit thinking, lack of equitable access to challenging and engaging coursework, lack of engaging parents in welcoming environments. Based on the work that we have done in our observations, based on what parents have said, who say counselors are too busy to actually see us, and we don't know what kind of courses will prepare our kids for college. And this is across the board of parents that we've spoken with. So then the question is, if the root cause of low performance is low expectation, it's like the Pygmalion effect. We think that kids can't do something, and so then we are unable to scaffold for more academic rigor, and so what does that look like? So what questions do you have for me? Please email me. We have a really strategic opportunity to do amazing work. As I said before, I've seen some of the most amazing, best instruction ever in my entire life. And, that's a pretty long life in education, over 50 years. And so we should be proud of the work that we're doing. We should commend teachers. We should highlight the work of principals in changing the culture of a school, based on the progress that we see. So it's not only the way in which we think about combining funds, braiding them with Title I, Title III, and state funds, but the way in which we create a really positive environment for teachers, who are doing wonderful work, and the way in which we use PLCs so that students become more self-regulating and feel a sense of, achievement. I just want to tell you what a privilege it is to work with you all. You should email me with more questions. The whole point of changing the way in which monitoring is done is based on the federal government's response to our ESSA plan for Title III, and they just asked us, again, the question is, how is the state agency supporting the LEAs in working with teachers in the classroom to make content, grade-level content, comprehensible to English learners? So that's the inquiry question that we come with you, and the feedback that we provide is a way for you to strategically think about how you look at your systems for equitable access and increased student growth. So thank you again. I've gone over a little bit. If you have questions, make sure you email me.